In a previous video, we said that every class has to be a subclass of something. Now that creates some rather interesting situations where I have one class that's a subclass of its parent, but then its parent is a subclass of something else. What we're talking about here is what is known as the subclass hierarchy. The idea is that I have a bunch of classes and I want to know, well, what is their subclass relationship to each other? In essence, what I'm talking about is drawing a family tree of classes, right? Because I've talked about how subclassing is like a parent-child relationship. To see an example of why this family tree is so important, let's go look at an example. So here in Atom Editor, I have a script open called app.py. This is a script, so let's go into the terminal. Let's go run this script. Now, as you can see, this is one of these fancy Kivy scripts that we've been using throughout the semester. It's popped up a window. This window says Hello World, but it does even more than that. This is a button. I can click on it, and you notice how it flashes between gray and blue. I'm going to move it off to the side here because I want to go look at the code and compare this. So here's the script, and now we can actually try to understand what's going on in a Kivy script. So Kivy is a really complicated module. It actually has a bunch of modules nested inside of it, like the module app. It also has a module called UIX. Inside of that, it has other modules like, say, label or button. For the most part, we're not going to worry about that right now. We're just going to focus on, well, the code that I've actually written. And if I scroll down, you'll notice that for as fancy as this application is, there's not actually a whole lot there. When I make a Kivy application, what do? Well, I need to make a class for my application. And then in my script code, I'm going to call the constructor to make an object of that class. And then tell that object, which is an application, to run. And then Kivy does its thing. That's all. Now you'll notice, by the way, there's no run method here at all. Well, that's because I didn't have to define it. If we look at my class definition, look at this. So there's a class called app. It is inside of the module kivy.app. And so by putting all of that inside of the parentheses, my application is now a subclass of that class. I have inherited the run method. I don't have to define it on my own. The only thing that I do have to define is this thing called the build method. And that's because, well, I need to tell Kivy what to do, how to put in all of the things like my hello world and make it a button. The code here is, you'll notice that the vast majority of it is just telling it how big to make the window and where to put it on the screen. Making a button, all I have to do is make a button object. You notice that, okay, I tell it what the text is and what the font size is, and I made it bold, but Kivy is doing all of the work for me with the button class. And indeed, this is the advantage of Kivy. We're going to be using this in the final assignment. We're going to be able to draw these sort of complex graphical applications because Kivy provides all of these classes for us that does all the work. All we have to know is, well, how do we use the classes? How do we know that? Well, how do we know how to do anything? The documentation. So I'm going to go pull up the Kivy documentation for button. And I'm not going to talk about this documentation that much because actually the Kivy documentation is a little advanced for us here at 1110. What's going to happen in the final assignment is I'm going to have some simpler documentation for us to read. But I do want to pull up the Kivy docs just so that you know what they look like, right? Professional software development is essentially exactly the same thing as what we've done in this course. It's just that, well, you know, the documentation is not quite as structured and as organized as what we do. But okay, here I have the documentation of button. And I have this up because I want to talk about, well, exactly what is a button. If I look over here, we'll notice, okay, I display Hello World on the screen and I can click on it. But okay, I mean, that's fine, but I might also want to draw text on the screen and not necessarily click on it. Well, that's something else. We would call that a label, and that's another class. If I go over here to the documentation, here I have the class label. And the class label is the thing that's responsible for, well, drawing fonts on the screen. And as I've said many times, I hate drawing fonts. It is way, way more complicated than drawing images. So good on the people here for creating the label class for us. But the button class also draws fonts, and we don't want to duplicate code. So indeed, what is the case is that the button class is a subclass of the label class. And why is that important? Well, remember that if something is a subclass like button, well, it inherits all of the features of label. So that means that if I want to know what button does, it's not enough to read the button documentation. I have to read both the button and the label documentation. But we're not even done there, right? So as we've seen with a lot of these Kivy apps, Kivy has lots of features like sliders and boxes that I can type in, and I can even do things like tabs. All of these things, anytime that you have, say, a module that provides you with a toolkit for making interactive graphical features, we call these interactive graphical features with a fancy name. That fancy name is a widget. And indeed, Kivy does have a widget class, and label is a subclass of widget. So, okay, that means that label inherits all of the features of widget. Oh, but wait, button inherits all of the features of label. So that means button inherits all of the features of label and widget. Oh, so to really understand everything that button does, I have to understand button and label and widget. Oh, but I'm not done there, because widget is actually complicated enough that Kivy has separated it out so that widget itself is a subclass of another class called widget base. So to understand what button does, I have to understand button and label and widget base. And finally, widget base is a subclass of object. And as we've seen already, it's always important to understand what's going on in object, because that's where a lot of the special double underscore features are. I've got 5 classes here. Button, which is a subclass of label, which is a subclass of widget, which is a subclass of widget base, which is a subclass of object. That is an example of a subclass hierarchy. And the reason why we need to know this is because of the documentation, because of how inheritance works. The way that I understand the class down at the bottom, button, is by understanding the functionality of all of the classes above it.